Welcome to Pineland Underground, the official podcast of the U.S. Army John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School.
Here we explore critical themes across the realm of Army Special Operations. This is Pineland Underground. All right, welcome back to the Pineland Underground podcast. And once again, we are recording from the Falcon Snail Pub.
Falcon Snail Pub.
And the owner, once again, has allowed us to use the space. Seems like a pretty cool dude again. Anyway,
very kind of him to let us use this space to record.
It's really amazing.
But today we have a guest brought on by Bobby Tuttle, who's been just talking about you for a while now. So that's kind of weird. But I'll go ahead and hand it over to Bobby so he can give the introduction.
Yeah, so Bobby Tuttle here. Absolute pleasure to be hosting Rob McQueen, a good friend, a mentor, and a coworker that I've worked with for years. We go back since our time working at the Special Operations Training Detachment down at Fort Polk, Louisiana, at JRTC, the Joint Readiness Training Center. I instantly gravitated towards Rob for his ability to really integrate civil affairs into what we were doing in the unconventional warfare scenario we had at the time, around 2015, 2016, and we've remained close friends since. So Rob himself, a civil affairs officer by trade, an entrepreneur, and humanitarian by passion and by nature. Rob graduated from the University of Idaho. What year was that, Rob?
Oh, man, 06.
Okay, 2006. Yeah. And really his military career began as a light infantry reconnaissance platoon leader, and then he moved on to a company executive officer, all within the 101st Airborne Division. So an infantry officer by nature when he first started out his time in the Army. And then following his time, Rob volunteered for Special Operations and graduated the Civil Affairs Qualification course and joined the Civil Affairs Regiment from then on. And Rob served as two Special Operations team leaders focused on counterterrorism and countering violent extremism operations in Afghanistan and also the Balkans. So pretty robust experience. He served worldwide in both named and contingency operations. And then he's worked with entities such as the United Nations, the European Union, NATO, and USAID, and then multiple non-governmental organizations focused on disaster response and really stability operations. He's been published on the importance of disaster response in international diplomacy. He's also served as a subject matter expert and panelist on countering violent extremism and then combating the growing foreign fighter phenomenon for the National Counterterrorism Center. So pretty robust experience. Rob, again, good friend. What I'd like to kind of add here too is a little bit after his pathway on active duty in the Army, Rob left active duty to join Waves for Water. And now Waves for Water is a guerrilla humanitarian organization focused on providing access to clean water to remote and austere communities. While at Waves for Water, Rob led disaster relief operations in over 30 countries across the globe. And then he also helped found the Veterans Division called the Clean Water Corps and deployed veterans on more than 40 missions to over 20 countries across the globe. He also works following the drastic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Rob left as a full-time humanitarian and founded a leadership development company, Sine Pare, which translates to without equal. Also our USASOC motto.
Oh, we completely stole the name.
That's okay.
Yeah, we stole it 100%.
And then their campus is in Texas. Sine Pare uses an experiential learning model to build leadership attributes and capabilities in junior and senior level executives from business to nonprofit sectors. So Rob, once again, just kind of a wave tops for your introduction, but hey, welcome to the show, man.
Yeah, thanks, brother. Thanks for having me on. I think I'm going to have to go back in and remove a lot of the $5 words out of the bio there.
But
that gets Bobby here. He gets allocated one officer point for that introduction.
I know. That was solid. Like he went all the way through it. I was impressed.
What I think is really impressive, though, and again, we're going to dive into some of these great topics here. You know, Rob served active duty, focused on civil affairs operations within special operations, but also the conventional force. He's dabbled in both.
Yep.
Then Rob also went out on the nonprofit side. And as a civil affairs reservist, used his expertise and experiences to go out and be a humanitarian. And he served as an entrepreneur, starting some businesses, bringing in like-minded individuals and rock star soft people that he's worked with, and taking those skills to provide disaster relief and response across the globe. So incredibly experienced. And actually, he's right now here at Fort Bragg with us here in North Carolina, instructing at the Civil Affairs Captain Career Course as a guest instructor because he has such a rock star background and experience. So
yeah, you got to pay the piper. I do that IMA gig. So, every month, 1 month a year, Uncle Sam gets his due.
You also get one more officer point. He said entrepreneur who has started businesses. The definition of an entrepreneur is just what it is.
Redundancy.
So like the officer points, I'll go for the redundancy piece.
Yeah, if you make sense, you get NCO points.
If you make up words, you get officer points.
More acronyms, officer points.
Oh, man.
All right, Rob. So let's talk about civil affairs within Army Special Operations, which we got Ranger Regiment, we've got SMUs. But for our definition right now, we'll clarify that Army Special Operations for this discussion is civil affairs, PSYOP, and special forces.
Yep.
And within that, we all have our different roles, but we function as teams, we deploy. But let's define civil affairs.
Oh, man. All right, defining civil affairs. So when I talk to, especially, so I'm kind of going back to my time as a team leader, like how did I describe what we do to either the task force commander to, even down to just my partner, when I was with the SEALs, SEAL Team 2, just like, hey, that sister platoon commander, hey, here's who I'm attached to. How do I tell them what I did? And so the way I've always described it is that we identify and assess civil vulnerabilities in order to mitigate or exploit those vulnerabilities in support of the commander's intent, right? So what does that mean? So
What does that mean, Rob?
Right? What does that mean? So I get to know and understand what makes a society tick, from all the way down at a local village level to at a larger economic infrastructure, political level. And if I understand what makes that tick, I can break it down and find out where there are gaps in that society. And when I mean gap, I mean where is the population not having its needs met by the government, or not having its needs met by the local structure, or not having its needs met by its local community and kind of those social structures. Because when I find out where that is, I can, one, identify who is leveraging that. Like when I say who, I kind of think like non-state actors, negative state actors, any of that negative piece that are trying to affect the environment in competition with us.
Okay.
Or I can understand and I can identify them and then try to kind of remove some of those gaps that they operate in. Or I can see how I personally can leverage those gaps by either closing it up and finding what the gap is, closing it, bring it together. Let's say, Maslow hierarchy of needs. And like the current day, number one is Wi-Fi. So let's find a way to put some Wi-Fi into a system, for lack of a simpler term.
Okay.
And I'll get into that piece because it's an interesting communications, an interesting piece in the modern environment. Or I can figure out how to kind of exploit that, right? So if we need to get our way into that gap, if we need to shape the society, then we can figure out how we can leverage that gap in society through either us providing influence, an NGO, or someone else providing that need that could then, delegitimize or work against that host nation.
Help me understand what you mean by mapping. Yeah, so for some of our listeners who may not be totally familiar with, what mapping a network looks like.
Yeah.
What does that look like in the construct of mapping the civil infrastructure or the players and who's involved, and then the things that make that populace or that community tick?
Right. So let's look at it from, say, and I had this conversation today with a good friend of mine. So let's take a look at, say, every small town has like a chamber of commerce, right? Or a city council. And on that city council, you're going to have your political leaders, you're going to have your business leaders, you're going to have that interaction between the two. So we would take the city council, the mayor, and we would draw a little circle around and be like, hey, this is the political side. And then we'd look at, say, okay, who do they know on the economic side? So let's find the business leaders and let's put them on a piece of paper and draw a circle around them. And then let's look at, hey, who are the social leaders? Like, who are the religious leaders? Who are the youth group leaders? Who are the sports coaches? Like, right? Who are the teachers? And who that's your social piece. And then we would find out where they all connect, right? And then we would kind of do that to understand and really draw a picture, like map, so to speak, but draw a picture that will represent the connections between people, buildings, infrastructure, systems, whatever it is that makes this small town tick. And then you can really take a look at it and understand really kind of how that community and how that population works. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So if we're going to break this down for, like, say, a junior 18 Bravo weapon sergeant on an SFODA,
right?
The civil affairs guy, he's your SME or your expert on all the stuff that you don't know because you're always worried about knowing guns and this stuff. But when you go into any country, there's going to be a village or something that you're working with people, and this guy is the one that can map all that out because that's what he dedicates his job to.
Exactly.
He's knowing everything that you don't want to because you're worried about your job.
Exactly. And so he can take all that off your plate. He can tell you what to look for. So when you're out training your partner force or you're doing any of your engagements, you can understand what he's looking for. And then you can start to take some weight off the team leader, the warrant, maybe the Fox, and start to be able to do and facilitate that targeting process from the civilian side, right? Like, how do we look at what exists in this area? Like, if we want to degrade a violent extremist organization and they use this logistics pathway to, support some of their fighters, well, hey, how can we degrade that logistics pathway through maybe a non-kinetic means? So that integration and targeting could kind of remove some of that extra lift and integrate into, I think, that fusion cell concept, I think, is where it sits.
And then that entity that you have there, that civil affairs entity, it's almost the ability to have the ultimate forced access and placement into almost any area that you want in the world, right?
That's exactly it. That's 100% it.
All right. You have a reason for being there. Like, yes. We know this guy who's a negative actor is here, but how do we get access to this place?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the benefit of it, especially when you look at kind of a compete environment, right? When you're looking at not a highly kinetic or a, that quote unquote peacetime environment, right? Because I'm not coming in. I am not a threatening team. I'm not bringing in 12 dudes that are here to teach other people to shoot, move, communicate, medicate, right? What I'm there to do is understand the issues that are happening. And then I can provide that feedback to both the TSOC that I'm working for and directly to the chief of mission and integrate with that interagency and work through all those different compartments. Be like, hey, did you know this was happening in this area? What are you curious about? And I had a lot of experience doing that at the U.S. Embassy in Sarajevo that really painted a picture for me of where we fit in kind of that mesh of the projection of U.S. power, right? And that diplomatic, information, military, economic
dime,
right? The dime,
and that's real, right?
I mean,
that's if you look at the history of just everything that we've ever done, right? Like even in Vietnam, it's like, oh, you know what? We've overplayed our hands, or we've overplayed our hand using the military as a means to influence the world, and everybody sees that. So now, how do we go back and play the diplomatic game to restore balance? But it's the same tactically. That's the
same thing.
That's what we do, right? And then I would say that the civil affairs person is your ultimate L&O for USAID, State Department, all these other entities which are very powerful and bring a lot to the table for you.
Absolutely.
If you check your ego and allow yourself to utilize them, right? We had an argument. We had a discussion in a previous podcast about the difference between use and utilize, but
for the intended purpose, it's use. For something that's not the intended purpose, it's utilize.
Which you could do both, right?
Utilize seems like a more technical term because it's like I'm going to utilize this weapon, this M4 to destroy an enemy threat.
Yeah,
but it's used for.
I'm going to use this EOD guy to clear this ID, or I'm going to utilize my CA team to clear this ID. Right?
I wonder what that looks like. Just throwing cert money out and see if it lands on an IED as we walk forward. Like, throw the 20, see if it blows it up.
So Chuck and I, you just talked about shoot, move, communicate, medicate, sustain, which I would kind of go through, and those are the specialty skills of a special forces team, which Chuck and I are we've kind of hit on that for previous episodes. Talk us through what a civil affairs team looks like, and the kind of specific roles or functions of everybody on that team. As they come into a country, and they're there not to shoot, move, communicate, medicate, and sustain, but focus on the government's portion and focus on the civil aspect. Yeah,
so when you look at a 4-man CA team, and they're different between special operations and conventional, and so I'll kind of focus on the special operations piece right now.
Sure.
And so you have a team leader that's a captain. You're going to have your team sergeant, who is your E7. And that team sergeant, again, this is that relationship team leader, team sergeant. They're responsible for everything the team does and fails to do. That team sergeant is the backbone and really looks at that team leader and be like, you are off the rails, brother. We need to dial this back. But he brings that experience really into that team. And then you're going to have, on the soft side, you have your 38 Bravo, which I don't know if they've changed it now for the soft. That's a whole.
And now 38's the military occupational specialty, or MOS.
Right. So you have 18 for SF, 37 for PSYOP, and then 38 for CA. Okay. And so the 38 Bravo is what your CA NCO, or what you're calling now the Civil Reconnaissance Specialist. So he is your brass tacks young NCO that is just getting after it. And his expertise is trying to get out, really look at what the civilian populace is doing and drive that kind of reconnaissance mindset, right? So he's the on the ground sensor that you're really focusing on using. So, and then on the other side of that, we have our 38 Delta or Whiskey, whatever it's called now, and that's our Special Operations Combat Medic. So we have a SOCM medic on each CA team on the soft side, which is just a huge force multiplier. You guys know with 18 Deltas, the SF medics, just the capability and the what they bring to the table is amazing. And so we used ours very heavily in Bosnia to build an entire training program for the counterterrorism forces and special police units in Bosnia that led to a lot of great things. But so that's the breakdown of that CA team.
Love it. Okay.
I do want to take that and go into the discussion about we were talking about earlier before we even started recording was main effort versus supporting effort versus checking your ego and using that fulcrum approach. And we were talking about a special program that we stood up in 2010, right? And we actually called that program the Population Studies Group. Sounds very CA heavy, right?
Population Studies Group.
I like that.
And it was when we stood up the Afghan National Army Special Forces program, and we just made their Special Forces teams with civil affairs and PSYOPs guys. They're just part of the team. But understanding that what we really had to do was understand first the terrain that we were going into, right? So if we can all check our egos out, and we're going into these teams, right? We were talking about, with cross-functional teams, unified action partners. Like everybody thinks that these words are new and that these concepts are new. Like no, we've always just functioned as teams in the military. But if you can check your ego, you can figure out what's most applicable right now that is going to get the most bang for the buck, right?
Absolutely.
Let's talk about that. Your opinions on that.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't. I don't think I could have said it any better. I mean, that's exactly.
You probably could have. It's just shocking.
It's exactly that. And so I looked out, and the best. My career on the soft side was kind of unique in my deployment to Afghanistan was with SEAL Team 2, and the SEALs had a bit of a kerfuffle that turned everything up. A few people left right when I got to the site. And they ended up bringing in another officer to come in and kind of fill the roles. It's the platoon commander, and he and I hit it off really well. Interesting, amazing, really one of the most amazing dudes I've ever met in my life. But we were able to sit down and be like, hey, if you want to, and SEALs, like if you want to go out and shoot somebody, this is how we're going to have to engage with the population. We need to go out every day. Here's the targeting and here's the assessments we need to understand. We need to understand the population around us because that is our center of gravity at this point. So what we did and kind of the way we looked at it is we just assigned those roles. Like, hey, in the beginning, like when we go out and start meeting with all these villages, hey, Rob, you and your team, main effort, right? Like we will support getting you in. We'll do primary, like we'll set security, we'll move in, you guys do the engagements, build that understanding, build the map of the society and what's going on, and then we'll go back and start kind of targeting through it.
And when you say engagements, you mean like meetings, the players,
exactly,
the people in the
so
community.
To clear that up, like a civil engagement to go sit down with like the local leaders, the guy that drives the water truck in and out, the guy that loads the trailer up with poppy and drives it down to the next village, right? So going through that process, right? And just getting to know everything that's happening and VSO or Village Stability Operations, like it was the idea of go village to village in the mountains of Afghanistan, get each of them to build up their own security force, manage their own population, and then move to the next village and go from there.
That was kind of similar to like a glorified neighborhood watch program?
Yep.
Okay.
Well-armed neighborhood watch.
Well-armed, but also able to protect themselves and then report on nefarious behavior to good guy forces so that they could prevent further trafficking of drugs, weapons, bad things.
Yeah, create those systems that allowed that society kind of function on its own and more or less build a bridge to initially us and then eventually to the Afghan government that would allow them to kind of support each other. Yeah. That was the goal, at least. And I think there were positives and negatives to that program, some wins and losses. But that was where we kind of aligned. And as we started to make a lot of headway and we went from about 500 meters of white space, and when I say white space, we could go about 500 meters outside of our little VSO site before we got shot up, right? Okay. And so we went from 500 meters to 10 kilometers to 20. And then we established a little 3-man outpost because we just had to own a piece of terrain, and then that would get hit all the time. But at that point, it was like, all right, so we've built a little white space. We're going to shift. Hey, we're going to go kinetic heavy for the next few days to kind of push the Taliban out, and then you were going to switch again. And so we would go into a kinetic heavy piece, and we would support the kinetic fight. And that would just shift. You would just shift who the main effort was, and you would just, for a small team, I think we had, for part of that, we had like 6 SEALs, my 4-man team, 2 PSYOP Bubbas, and 11 uplift infantry, and that's all we had. And so we just would rotate on who was really kind of running the ground force command piece, who was diving into it based on what we needed to do. And it just worked phenomenally well because there were no egos. Everyone was in the fight together. And we made a lot of headway until, and eventually you outpace your logistics and support and, things go down from there. But I think that's the best way. And I don't know, Chuck, if that answered your question of really
I think that's important, right? 'Cause let's just throw out the definition of war, right? Socially sanctioned violence in order to meet a political end state, right? So although there's violence involved, it's always a political end state. So when people say, this is getting too political or this, at the end of the day, warfare, the army is a means to achieve. We're the tools of a politician at the end of the day, right? You don't just go fight a war to fight a war. You fight a war to influence something somewhere in order to achieve some kind of goal for the nation, right? But when we're deployed, a lot of times you got to figure, okay, what's the best way to influence this environment around me to achieve that? And right, we have DIME. People can argue whether we need more or less, but the reality is you have to figure out where you need to apply that, and on the battlefield, which element right now within my whole inventory of this team is the best to use in order to affect what I'm doing here within my mission to achieve whatever your strategic goal is to achieve that political end state. Sometimes we don't know what the political end state is. Like I could say in Afghanistan, I was fighting there for 20 years. I didn't really understand what it was. Maybe I just missed the briefing. I don't know.
You didn't get the memo.
There were a few memos sent out. I don't know which one you want to look at.
I didn't get the memo, but at the end of the day, that's what we're geared for. What do we, and it's not always kinetic.
No.
Right?
Well, sorry.
Well, I was going to chime in with kind of Chuck's comments is like, you look at the DIME construct, so the military or war, using the military for war is kind of a last resort.
Right.
Mm-hmm. However, the military functions that we have, especially within special operations, are left of bang. Left, phase zero. If you look at phases of operation, phases of conflict, left of before bad things happen, and they are intended to be preventative, intended to be a deterrent, but also it is understanding what's happening on the ground. So if bad thing happens, crisis, overthrow, coup, you name it, war turns into the option, then we, the U.S. military, is prepared because they have mapped that civil environment. Mm-hmm. They know what the infrastructure looks like, the needs of the people, the will of the people, the political infrastructure and decision makers on the ground, so that we can try to influence and then, as the last resort, destroy, go to war.
It's interesting too, because I think when you look at it, there's two aspects to a functioning, successful society, and they're kind of a weird piece too. I mean, one's legitimacy, right? Like if the people don't believe in that government, if they don't actually support it and submit to the socially agreed rules, like the political systems, then it's not going to work. The other side of it is a monopoly on violence, and I think this is what people don't understand: is a functioning society doesn't mean there's no violence. It just means that the government owns the monopoly on violence, right? And so when you're looking at Afghanistan, when you're looking at any, actual kinetic environment, Iraq post 2003, especially in 2007, 2008 when I was there, like we are competing with another organization that is trying to take that monopoly on violence and the legitimacy from that government. So there is no peaceful society. There is always somebody with a gun, and you just want that gun to generally belong to the system that belongs to the people, and it doesn't always work that way.
Really well put. Rob, does anybody within the Department of Defense do what Civil Affairs does?
No. I think not to an extent. So, and when you look at it, it's kind of interesting, right? So you have civil affairs operations, and then you have civil military operations, right? So when I was an infantry officer or an infantry platoon leader, we did civil military operations. I remember negotiating contracts between sheikhs for the Sons of Iraq program. Like, all right, I need 200 fighters from you. I need 200 fighters from you. All right, what do you want? All right, you need this chicken coop up? All right, I'll go find somebody that can open the chicken coop so I can get the 200 fighters from your tribe. Like, this is going to happen. Like, I never thought in a million years I would be doing that, right? It's a raid, and then I'm negotiating chicken coops. So that's civil military operations, right? And those are generally planned by civil affairs officers at a higher headquarters.
And then executed by
regular military, right?
Okay.
That is non-civil affairs. So it is CMO, right? Civil military operations. Everybody does it because we've realized, especially at this point, and CA really started back in World War II in the occupation of Germany. But we really look at this and it's like, hey, there is no warfare without the civil populace, especially in today's environment. And when today is kind of asymmetric or, irregular threats, if you want to call it that way. And so you have to pay attention to it. So everyone has to be involved in civil military operations. Then you have civil affairs operations, which are a little more targeted, a little more specific, and geared towards really painting and targeting and understanding that civilian environment, that civil common operating picture. And that is executed and planned by civil affairs soldiers.
So you're telling me, as I was a Special Forces detachment commander for ODA 1125 combat divers, from Okinawa, deployed to Afghanistan.
Always got to put out. I was a combat
diver. Dive guys.
One officer point.
and I had my beard in Afghanistan with my team, and I was meeting with our provincial leaders and having chai over a KLE, a key leader engagement, with my fighters, with my Afghan local police, and my Afghan Special Forces commandos. I was doing civil military operations.
That's correct.
That were planned out primarily through a civil affairs team at a higher headquarters. Passed down.
Should have been in that theory. And again, we go back to the strategy above. And SF's a unique piece because the entire role of SF is to work inside that local population, right? And so, but yes, in theory, that engagement, that thought process should have been at least heavily influenced by the S9.
Let's talk about that. I wrote this out while you were talking here on this piece of paper because I was just like, okay, this is pretty interesting. So civil affairs, PSYOP, SF, right? So the primary mission of civil affairs is to legitimize or work on legitimacy, with another aspect to also work on delegitimizing sometimes, right?
Right. Absolutely.
But PSYOP, the primary, is delegitimizing, with another mission to legitimize when needed. And you got special forces, which foreign internal defense and unconventional warfare goes either way, right? But then when you combine all three, pretty powerful.
Exactly.
Mind blown.
I read a little diagram here.
We're going to publish that.
Got the arrows and everything. I love it.
That'll go on the Pineland Underground website.
But it's not a new concept. Like, we've been doing that forever, right?
No, and it's really interesting because what you went on, and from what I've seen on the contract side, working with the cross-functional teams, is what I really see is I see CA really heavily integrating into that targeting cycle, and so almost in like kind of the find fix realm, right? And then you end up with PSYOP being able to hit that influence environment, right? Hit the information world and try to influence things through that network. And then you run into SF that can do the finish work on other avenues, more kinetic avenues. And that's where I've really seen it work well together. And it just depends on that integration between the CA team that's attached to the ODA, that team leader, and then the ODA commander, and that relationship, and how well that CA team can integrate into how that ODA runs.
So let's go down that hole real quick. So you're telling me, Rob, and again, we've worked together previously and down at the Joint Readiness Training Center, where we kind of started our friendship, having worked together and complementing roles and just having fun down there. So you're telling me that civil affairs, PSYOP, and special forces have their own kind of swim lanes of missions or purposes that they do.
Right.
But it can all come together.
Absolutely.
And they all complement one another. So you just hit on the term cross-functional team.
And they all overlap a little bit, right?
100%. 100% overlap a little bit. And I would say they are heavily
more than
weighted.
A little bit. They overlap. Everybody's got their primary function.
Yep.
But used together. Boom.
Boom.
Boom. And that's exactly it.
So, we're throwing around the term cross-functional team. It's a non-doctrinal term from my understanding.
I hate it.
We just go with team. I think from here on out.
Yeah, like we said earlier, entrepreneur starts businesses. Cross-functional team. Like, a team it's already that. It's like task organized for purpose. It's ridiculous.
Yep. We should really go to every NFL team and be like, how's your cross-functional team?
You
have a lineman, you have your kicker, you've got a defensive line,
right?
The
NFL doesn't use cross-functional.
It's exactly it. Just a team.
It's not a sports cross-functional team.
Everyone has their role on a team, right? You don't have to tell them it's different.
Yeah, So I had a great call with the guys down at SOTD, Special Operations Training Detachment today, focused on
another officer point.
how RSOF, Army Special Operations, is training in a large-scale combat operations environment. So you got the premier combined training centers, the CTCs, JRTC at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and NTC at Fort Irwin, California.
Desert in the swamp. Desert in the swamp.
And you've got a team of about 30 soft people, commanded by a post battalion commander 05, about to be 06, that kind of covers down on the individuals that serve as observers, coaches, and trainers, and plan the exercises for those special operations teams to go train. And it's phenomenal training. Couldn't speak more highly of the turnkey type training that happens down there. But what I want to get into is our soft task force. So we're training in a large-scale combat operations, the future fight, right, against near-peer adversaries, Russia, China, similar to what's going on right now in Russia and Ukraine, right? Occupation of forces, multi-domain operations, things are happening in space, cyber, on the ground. There's no battlefront lines per se. And so down there, the RSOF task force. So you have a special forces company commanded by an 04 with his elements, support elements. You have a fires individual or fires entity, SEMA, electronic warfare. You have civil affairs, PSYOPs, special operations teams, Alpha, SOD-A's. You got all these things that come together. And I think what we're talking about is that's a RSOF task force or a cross-functional team, but you can task organize.
Just had to throw it in
All
there.
this sounds like, let's go back to 1991 Gulf Forward air-land battle, which we proved works, right? It's just take everything and use it together.
That's it.
That's all it is.
But it's the synchronization of its use.
Ooh, does that get an officer point for synchronization? I think so.
Because if you look at an orchestra, you're not going to use every single instrument at once.
No.
They're going to play, they're going to build up. Some sort of note's going to happen in the orchestra that you can't use another note for. And so at phases of the operation and phases of conflict, the civil affairs team probably doesn't need to be on the front lines. Probably it does not need to be in the front lines of the close fight of conflict where I would say bullets are flying immediately overhead and you're being targeted. You want your entities to be geographically located so that they can best complement the mission at hand.
Right. I think that's exactly it, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to be in that front spot. I think you just have to look at where do we need them to be? Do we need them on the ground with that ODA based on what that mission set is? And LSCO is an interesting one. I think we could go down 1,000 different lanes about how an ODA is utilized in LSCO. But I think,
used. Either way. Mostly utilized.
Is it are we utilized or used?
We just had a whole argument with the creditors that came from TRADOC about our utilization or use in LSCO operations. It was like, no, you guys, primary purpose is direct action. No, that's a very small part of what we do.
Very small.
So for us to do a whole planning scenario in every PME based on direct action is ridiculous.
Yep.
Go ahead, Rob.
I agree. But it really comes down to when you build a team, you have to understand, what do I need this team to accomplish?
Yes.
And what skill sets do I need in that team, right? So it's that simple. I don't know why it becomes more complicated than that. Probably egos and arguments over OERs. I think a big one I've seen is money, right?
Yeah.
I remember the back and forth around UW, and it was like, hey, conventional Army wants to own an AOB. They want it pieced off to that brigade. And they want it pieced off because, hey, guess what? The conventional mission's going away. We want to own a piece of this because with a mission comes money.
Sure.
And so, and everyone is going to fight. It was put to me very well by a 06 in Germany from SWCS. And he goes, and I was kind of trying to negotiate some of that security cooperation money for Bosnia and have that discussion. I was very animated, very enthusiastic captain sitting at a table with 05s and 06s. And he goes, hey, come over here. I was like, all right, listen. It's like, I get it. I understand what you want to accomplish. But what you have to understand is you're not the only person at the table. And you may or may not be the main effort. But the other thing you have to understand is you're not always the hero in the fight, bro.
Yes.
Like, you got to take a step back and realize, like, oh, I'm fighting for my peace. And everyone should fight for their peace. Like, nobody should lay down and be like, you know what? You don't need me. But you should be willing to, like, hey, I presented my case. This is why I think I'm the best one to execute this target or to generate this effect. And, if everyone goes, hey, that's not you, cool. How can I support you? Right? Take the step back and be like, hey, you got it. Where do you need me so you can achieve the objective? But that's a tough thing to do.
I'm going to go to kind of a football reference here. And, again, everybody has their job to do, a specific role on whatever play it is, right? So you got a run play, right? You need your blockers to go actually block, and that is a main effort because the running back, the fullback can't get into the open space without that block that you made first. Pass play, the play action, wide receiver can't get open unless he has a screen or the play action doesn't occur so that it draws the linebackers in from the quarterback to make that nice open pass. And so everybody has to do their job at whatever specific point. But the whole intent is to win the game.
Completely.
And so I think it's a great analogy right there, and I think you hit it on the head, Rob.
I actually want to steal it a little bit because I think it talks to, and we can talk about what CA does and go down the route, but I think the relationship between CA, SIAP, and SF is a really interesting one. And so when you look at, for lack of a better one, the personal relationship inside of that football analogy, right? Because you have Tom Brady as his favorite receiver, right? They have that faith in that running back. Like the coach is deciding, hey, at this point, who's going to be able to get it across the goal line? Who's going to be able to get it in? And I think that's where, when you really look at the relationships and you look at the teams, is do we have that relationship where SF goes, that the ODA commander or the task force commander goes, okay, CA, you're the best one to execute this. Do I have faith in you to do it? And that's going to be based on their previous experience. If it's a task force commander, it's going to be their previous experience working with CA on an ODA. And it's the same thing vice versa. So if we're working in a more non-kinetic environment, CA has the lead, and I need a JSET to come in, do I trust that JSET's going to come in and not burn any of the relationships that I've built? And it's an interesting dynamic that I think is very unique to special operations because the formations are so small and the missions are run so far away from the flagpole that those interpersonal relationships, I think, are what makes SOF so successful, but also is what makes it difficult for us to really quantify what that team looks like and how these task force are supposed to operate and execute.
Yeah, I'll say I'm just thinking back when I was a younger special forces guy, I used to hate the term kinetic versus kinetic. I'm like, no, so I signed up for it's all direct action, and I didn't understand it. But then, looking back, I just didn't realize I didn't have the picture of the game, and that's why I didn't look at it like
you
knew
the play, not the game.
It's all a game, right? It's a geopolitical game. It's when you're there in country. That's the game for achieving a win. What does it look like? What is the end state? But the reality is, kinetic means aren't always necessary. Non-kinetic means aren't always the right answer. But how do you balance those out to where and use the right tools for the job? And just thinking back, I probably didn't understand why it was important until way too late, right? But as a younger, you're like, oh, it's stupid. I signed up to do this, and this isn't what I signed up for. Like, no, you signed up to play the game. There's no draft, right? And the game does not give a shit about your opinion. The game is what it is. So if you don't adapt to it to win it, you're not going to win. You don't show up to a game Monopoly and not understand the rules, or think the rules are stupid and dominate the game. You got to take a step like, okay, let me understand the rules, and then I'll play and win.
Yep.
Right?
It's never cool to be ignorant.
Never cool
No.
We've all been there. We've all been there thinking that we know everything.
Oh, yeah.
So, all right. So, real quick, I'm looking at my point ledger here, and I actually gave you 1 point for use of the word kerfuffle earlier. Kerfuffle, yeah. So, you guys are almost evenly tied right now.
Could have used the word mutiny, but I thought kerfuffle was a little nicer.
I want to talk now about, we use the word unified action partners, but let's talk about unified action partners versus interagency stuff, and then on the ground talking about, hey, we want to win, so how do we play the game appropriately, which is not always just whack-a-mole, or what everybody wants to do is go shoot and get in a gunfight, which is fun, but if you're actually going to dominate that battlefield, how do you get there and assess and utilize everything that's available to you? Like if you go to Firebase, there's probably a CMOC, there's probably USCID reps, and there's probably somebody there, if they're not attached to you, with some kind of CERT funds, if it's with the Army unit there or with you. What are those things, for one, and then how do you use them?
Yeah, so I think Unified Action Partners is a really interesting piece because it's organizations and individuals outside of your organization, right, that all have a shared piece in the end state. Like everyone wants to achieve the same thing for a variety of different reasons, but it's kind of a shared end state. And so using them or utilizing them, how you bring that together, for a commander is really hard because they don't belong to the task force. They don't belong to you. In fact, in a lot of instances, they might actually be completely opposed to working with you, even though they want to achieve the same thing.
Like, and you might be opposed to working with them.
And you might, absolutely, at times. So when you look at that, really what you have to talk about, so you have non-governmental organizations, you have other nonprofits, you have local agencies, local government organizations, you have local power brokers, you have USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, you have the Department of State and all the wealth of offices and departments underneath the Department of State. And you have all of these things, and then foreign governments as well that have all of these other entities, the United Nations.
Did our forefathers have to like worry about these organizations on the battle space?
100%. How do you think we got all the weapons from the French? The French are your first unified action partner.
That's a great point.
Think of the Alamo Scouts. Think of the integration with the Native American trackers and warriors. Like, think of that entire piece. We've been running unified action partners forever. Thanksgiving is the first celebration towards unified action partners. If you look at it that way, that's probably a reach, but I thought I'd throw that one out there. So when you look at it, really what I always tell my students and I learned myself is you have to build a relationship. Because I think if I can have one theme to this, it's have a relationship with the people you work with. If you can't build a relationship, you're not going to work well together.
Okay.
And then the other side is create a shared vision. And a good commander should learn how to create a shared vision anyway. If you can't do that internal to your team, it's going to be hard to do it outside. But if you can create that shared vision, communicate it well, and then communicate how they feed into that kind of joining of efforts. I don't want to say synchronization because we're just going to go down a path. And I want to stay under 2 officer points on this trip. But that's the thought process, right? Like, how do I get an organization like myself as a humanitarian, right? Like working for Waves for Water. How do you get me and my goal, which is to provide access to clean water? How do you get me to work with you or to like even synchronize kind of in time and space,
okay.
Like, or at least, share a 4x4 on the way out to the site. How do you get me to work with you so I know that our intentions are the same and that my organization is not going to suffer from working with you, right? From a visibility standpoint or even from an operational and security standpoint. Mm-hmm. So that's the rub with Unified Action Partners. They're a critical piece. And I think we do, in general, a poor job as a military. And I think often we end up taking on a lot of work ourselves. I think the military SOF in general tends to take on a lot of that workload because we have.
That's due to ego, though, or do you think that's due to other?
I think it's one of those things when you get in that fist fight, right? When you are engaged at that level, and I don't always mean kinetic, but when you are, hey, this is my AO, this is what I'm trying to achieve, this is where I'm trying to go, you only have so much bandwidth. And it takes a lot of energy to manage different relationships, different egos, different end states, different motivations, and time, right? It takes a ton of time to do this. In my 10 months in Bosnia at the end, or 11 months in Bosnia, at the end of that trip working at the U.S. Embassy, I was smoked. The more tired and smoked than I've ever been. I was more tired than after 15 months in Iraq, and I was more tired than after 10 months in Afghanistan. I was way more smoked because building those relationships, maintaining those relationships, and then because of the things that happened while I was in Bosnia, actually like monetizing those networks, for lack of a better term, like actually using those relationships to achieve an effect. That was an absolute smoker. I was crushed. And I got to do a lot of fun things. I had a great time, but I was emotionally drained. And for a huge extrovert like myself, for me to actually want to just go hide in my team house was a unique experience to me. I would get calls from the ODC being like, Rob, come out and have a beer, man. It's been a good day. I'm like, no, it's 5 p.m. I'm eating a shawarma and I'm going to bed. Because I was just tapped. So
is there any place that special operations goes to get practice reps in working with Unified Action Partners?
So it's interesting. Yes, the CTCs do it. So they do bring in Unified Action Partners. Waves for Water is actually going to go out. I'm going to take 5 of my Clean Water Corps team at the invite at NTC to be a Unified Action partner next year for some of the soft rotations, which I think will be great. A good friend of mine is out running the engagement cell out there. And he's like, hey, can I put you? He's like, I don't know when it's going to be, but can I put you on the books and you bring a team out to be a legit Unified Action Partner? It's like, absolutely.
Shout out to the CTCs, NTC, and JRTC for SOP entities looking to go get good turnkey training. Again, a little shout out there, of which Rob and I have good experiences.
Good and bad.
Almost, yeah.
Good and bad.
Hey, I'll just say real quick, everybody in SOF seems to talk smack about NTC, JRTC, even the infantry, which I went to both.
Yep.
And I've never been to NTC and SOF, but I've never had a bad experience at a joint training because it's what you make it. I mean, it always sucks. In the infantry, one time they're like, hey, you're going to take these TOW missiles and you're going to help them with this mountain. We're like, oh, that's going to suck. And it sucked. But looking back, it was It's still a great experience.
It's what you put into it. And I think, it probably speaks to your personality. Like, I'm getting an opportunity to train. I'm going to train as best I can. And the CTCs give you
Everything.
a huge opportunity to train.
If you use it.
If you use it. And that's it. Like, I've seen ODAs go out and just absolutely crush it. And I think the last 4 rotations I did as a contractor with ODAs, I was incredibly impressed. Like, young team sergeants, Foxes filling that role, young team leaders, and just aggressively going after it and learning. And it was such a good experience to be a part of. And then I've seen times when they go out and they're like, we're done. Yep. And they just decide, I'm going to take off my shirt. I'm going to sit down, get some sun, might jump in a pond and wash off a little bit. And then eventually my time's going to run out and I'm going to go home.
We have a name for those. You got ODAs, right?
Yeah.
But you also got Brodias.
Not combat dive teams.
Operation Attachment Alphas, and then your Brodias.
So when they get their Patagonias, do they automatically come with a pop collar? Is that how that works?
You're a Brodia.
Last plug for the CTCs. Then we'll kind of move on. But
I don't know if they need a plug because it's one of those like you're going to go.
You're gonna go.
There's no plug.
There's no plug.
You don't have a choice.
Yeah.
It's like, man, do we need to buy this? Like, no, it's not tickets to the Bahamas. It's just,
as a place though where you can take your special operations entity, integrate with as an RSOF task force, get all your training that you want to do. You get to partner with a pretty robust partner, get coached from experienced individuals, of which Rob and I were both observers, coach, trainers. That's how we met. You got experienced special operations people as your role players, as they're coaching you through, just like the COLEXs across RSOF. And then you get to show and really not just articulate, but show the conventional force that you're working with how we fight and what we can do, and that value proposition that they get to experience and be like, holy shit, this is what SOF does. I get it. And I want to work with these guys in the future.
So 27. Hold on, Rob. 27. That's how many officer points you secured for that diatribe.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think he's positioned himself well for a solid AAM.
He's like,
from the boss selling these.
And then listening to this.
Yes.
And I can...
Well, and the other one, too, is he's really positioned himself well to a post-retirement contracting gig at one of the CTCs as well. Like, as a role player. Like, this is, or as a coach mentor. Like, you are just absolutely dialed in there, Bobby.
All right. Hey, we're going to shift gears here as much as I want to preach about the CTCs, because I love JRTC as a job. That's awesome people down there.
So you loved Leesville.
Oh, it's horrible.
Hold on. So Alexander.
Anyway, let's not get on this rainbow. Okay, let's go to the next topic. Come on.
I mean, you've got the daiquiri shack, drive-through daiquiris, and mud bugs. That's one stop. That's all you need.
And you have the big Ritter in Walmart.
The Ritter Walmart.
My hometown is an hour from Leesville. I get it. Let's move on. All right. Let's move on.
Shout out to Wagon Master's best steak in that in the area.
And you're a 40-minute drive to the border of Texas.
Yep. Which looks like the rest of Louisiana.
Rob, talk to us about Bosnia.
Oh man. So I lucked out. Right. I think I got my first team, went to Afghanistan, and then I got a second team, which, as an ODA commander, you often don't get that much. So I had over 4 years of being a team leader, which was phenomenal. So I took the second team in Bravo Company 92nd and got tapped to go to do what was called a CIMSI, or a Civil Military Support Element, in Bosnia. And so that is an element that often, in my case, worked directly for the Chief of Mission or the Ambassador. Had an office inside the U.S. Embassy, and was geared towards understanding the networks that existed in Bosnia, and at the time those networks that were supporting foreign fighters from the Balkans into Syria. And so my job was to understand those networks, and then understand the civil situation, the civil conditions that allowed those networks to function, and then share that information with both SOCUR and the ambassador and his team. And it was an amazing experience. I had a rad team house, lived in Sarajevo, which I'd never been to before, which is unbelievable. And I met probably the first mentor I had in the U.S. in the military, or in my career, which was Colonel Scott Miller, who was a defense attaché.
Okay.
Incredible man, still a mentor to this day. He retired in Greece and is just doing well at life. And then another one, Lieutenant Colonel, then Colonel, now retired, John Frick, who is he was a former 10th Group guy, and then went FAO. And those two men absolutely shaped that. Honestly, that entire office, the DAO there, was just a huge influence on me and gave me the trust and faith to really find a way to understand what was going on. I was lucky enough to be really the first team to have a full operation cycle. The team that came in before me did the entire mission setup, right? They got our house together. They got our vehicles lined up. They didn't really have a chance to operate. And so when I came in, it was like, hey, world's your oyster. Your support structures are in place. Go to work. And so I went and I spent 3 months, one, building relationships in the embassy, which was more cocktail parties than I remember.
It's a rough life.
It's a rough life. It's fun for a minute. And then honestly, it was a lot of fun. It's work, but it is fun. Built a lot of relationships, and I started to build relationships with the Bosnian military, rad program and amazing people called ISATAP. And I'm probably going to screw this up, but the International Criminal Investigation and Training Program, run by the Department of Justice. And so they work with foreign police forces and judiciary systems to bring in that kind of investigative and improve the law enforcement of the country, right? And so was able to get in with them and identify a major gap in their counterterrorism units. And so their counterterrorism units in Bosnia are super interesting because they were all the former Yugoslav SF prior to the war. And so their commander from the Federation, Mirsad Vilic, who I became good friends with, was the commander of like the Yugoslav SF at the beginning of the war.
Okay.
And so he's like, yeah, we came together. We're like, hey, sorry, this is going to be really tough. They literally split up the ammo, split up their radios, like in the team room. I was like, good luck, brother. I'll see you on the other side.
Holy smokes.
And so they would have a conversation. I would sit down and have beers with them and chat with them about it and go through this thought process. And they would be like, yeah, I would call my friend and be like, I'm sorry I shot your buddy today, but it was you or him. And I saw you in the scope and it wasn't going to be you. And it was incredible to learn from these guys. And they were a near peer on the CT side as a special police unit.
Okay.
And then also going up and working with the Republic of Srpska. So Bosnia is split into kind of two states. The Federation, which is the Croats and the Bosniaks, the Muslims, and then the Republic of Srpska, which are basically the Bosnian Serbs. And so they had two separate governmental structures, two separate special police units. We worked and trained with both, and we built basically our version of TCCC and trained all of them, and also brought the Bosnian military into it. And so I spent probably 4 months building all of this. And then that kind of takes me up to, I built those relationships. We're running the program. I'm building relationships. I brought the Brits in. I brought ambassadors. We did a few dog and pony shows to really get international support for it. And then Russia decides that Crimea is a critical entity and they take it. And so I was sitting in Bosnia when that happened, and I watched Sakir go through its immediate rapid
Was that a
process.
surprise to anybody, though?
Yes.
Really? Looking back, I was like, man, Georgia should never been a surprise. Like, I believe if we look back, like, Putin's been pretty open about his goals, right?
Telegraphs
I think that we were surprised because we chose to be surprised.
Yep, I think so. I think it was one of those where I think they knew it was going to happen, but once it did, it just kind of went. And so that set everyone on fire for a little bit.
It was a total surprise, everybody. It was a surprise that we had a lot of Ukrainian students in the Q course. They were also surprised.
Yeah.
And we had to figure out how to send them back, right? But it was like, wow.
Yeah.
What was that day like when Little Green Men showed up in
a lot of emails. A lot of emails and a lot of go get on the high side. Like, you need to go get on the high side now.
Do you think we should have been surprised, though?
No.
It's kind of like, I think, like, you look back and let's look at when Iraq invaded Kuwait, right? You should have been surprised, but the majority of the Kuwaiti military was on leave.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, and I think, and this is one of the things that I learned from this and working with the interagency folks at the embassy and listening to them, and especially listening to analysts, right? And listening to analysts try to pitch what they see as a target and getting to be a part of that process to be like, okay, so what is a threat? What is a target? What fits to what we're looking at? And watching the different pieces of the intelligence community try to negotiate and argue over what is a target. Mm-hmm. You know, what are your sources telling you? What are your sources telling you? What do you see this being? Hey, do you agree with me? What do you think? And so while I don't think it was totally a surprise, I think that as everyone who has a piece of that pie, as everyone is trying to predict and understand and build those contingency plans, I think you run into that thought process of like, nobody really gets it right. And often you run into people that are, maybe one person has piece A, maybe one person has piece B, and they just can't bring it together.
It's not clear.
It's just not clear, right? Yeah. There's no clarity to it. And so as much as we believe that Putin telegraphs, like I was shocked at I thought he was going to just kind of
I think it was a matter of when, right? Because I don't think it's ever been okay, Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia are what they believe, puts together what they need, and economically it makes sense, right?
Totally.
you look at the fall of the Soviet Union and what it put Russia, in as far as economically, they need those entities to be competitive. So to me, it's not a question of would it happen, it's when would it happen, because it makes sense. If I was in issues, I'd probably do the same thing. Maybe not like he did it, but I would probably have the same goals because it makes sense for the country.
I was more
That
shocked
sounds
at
weird.
how
I'm not a Russian sympathizer at all. But if I had to look at it from a logical point of view as a country, and I was stating the same things he was stating, okay, I've said what my goals are.
Yeah.
You being surprised is your fault.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the shock for me was kind of two ends on the Ukraine piece, to kind of take a little left here. But it was the way that he went about it, and then it was the response from Ukraine. I had a few conversations. I was like, "This is
You
not
hadn't surprised him?
Absolutely. I think they underestimated the level of training.
Yeah.
I think they underestimated the level of training and the competency of Ukrainians, specifically their soft.
What happened there? Why do you think that was where it was? Or why do you know that was where it was? That's the question.
Yeah, having spent some time in soccer and understanding that the push after 2014. And really the level of training that went into, like you said, we had Ukrainian SOF in the Q course here before they went over.
That investment that started about 7 years ago.
It did. It started in 2014.
That's not sensitive information for them. You guys are putting it on what it is.
Yeah. No, and we did a phenomenal job. And I got to sit down in my time over in Eastern Europe a month or so ago. I got to sit down with some of those, the SIMSI team that was SIMSI Ukraine, and sit down and listen to them and their piece and understanding how that works. And it's Zelensky, I think, blew my mind. He's putting on a masterclass in crisis leadership and messaging, I think, personally. And I think he's been one of the reasons the competency and the success of their military in small engagements and in some large engagements. And then the other side of it, the ability to message and drive that into a national identity. Ukraine's national identity is rooted in history at this point. And it will, depending on the outcome of this, which I think we can all see is slowly shifting towards a positive Ukrainian outcome. I think the national identity of Ukraine is going to be rooted in this moment, is going to be buried in history, and in my mind stand up to almost like the founding of our country and how they look at it, because this is definitely an underdog that has risen up and fought beyond any expectation.
Yeah. What do you think happens, since we're on the subject right now, after that? What's rooted in Russia's history?
I think it depends on how they leave or how this ends. If they end up solidifying the eastern side of Ukraine in a negotiation, if they end up making it uninhabitable through other means, and exfilling, giving themselves an easy out. I always looked at that as, subversion or sabotage on a nuclear facility and just leaving a wasteland that created a buffer, that's just my own personal, it gives them an easy out while saving face and blaming on the Ukrainians, which is kind of the Russian model. But I think, depending on how Russia moves forward from this, I think we're watching the transition. Putin, his health issues, his age. I think we're going to see how Russia responds to that kind of void that's going to be there, and how they respond to that void and what they look like in 10 years is going to dictate how they view this moment in their history.
Very well said. I like that. Let's kind of go back to Bosnia.
Yeah, Bosnia.
Your past
Took a left.
Bosnia.
Yeah, so Crimea happens, so Ukraine happens, take one. And then, so we kind of restructure and go through a rethought process, then more or less just get back on track to the exact same mission that we had before. And then in 2014, June, I believe, we had the 100-year floods in Bosnia. And this event really defined my life. And so at this point, we're up in the Republic of Srpska in a town called Banja Luka, and we're training the CT unit, or the Special Police Unit, up north. My team sergeant and I are leaving we brought in a few extra SOCA medics, working through doing the training, and we start heading south, and the river starts to flood, no kidding, and little Hyundai Elantra, man, and the water's coming up over the road, and we have to stop because it's up over the wheels, turn around and race back north because we couldn't make it to Sarajevo, driving away as the flood is flooding. So we spent 2 weeks up in the floodplain. I think almost 3 million people were displaced overnight. It was massive. So Sava River, which runs through Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, just went. It was crazy, to the point of where you would walk into the third story of a house because the mud had filled up the first 2 stories. It was catastrophic. It was my first real experience. I'd seen damage in Iraq. I'd blown up plenty of buildings. Same thing in Afghanistan, but this was what was an amazing country in the morning. The damage was done overnight, and it was insane. And so when that hit, I kind of looked around and we just went to work. Colonel Miller did an incredible job of bringing resources in from Army warehouse in Italy. We helped coordinate the international response up north. And then we finally, roads cleared up and we were able to get back down to our team house in Sarajevo. Then I went from, muddy roughs. I took a shower, I threw a suit on, and I went to represent U.S. Embassy at the UN and the cluster meetings in natural disaster. And so at that point, we really kind of stood back and started to look at from more of our perspective, like, okay, so we have a huge vacuum. We have this catastrophic event. Who's trying to influence the space? And we found like 15 different communities that were completely cut off. They were receiving some funding from sources we didn't understand, but they were completely cut off and had no water. And so I called a buddy of mine from the Captain's Career Course, who was a company commander in Afghanistan and had worked with Waves for Water, the founder. Brought him over to, I think, Kunar Valley. And they did a project. It was very successful. And I called him. I was like, hey, man, do you have that filter guy's number? He's like, I do. I called him. I was like, John, we spoke once before I went to Afghanistan. I'm in Bosnia now. Do you want to come over and do some work? And he was like, absolutely. When do you want me on a plane? I was like, cool. And we talked budget. We worked it out. I made some phone calls. I started doing the approval process to spend some of my P11 dollars to get it done. And so we got the approval process cleared. John got on a plane.
Define P11 dollars though for
operational fund
for special operations.
For special operations, correct. And so there's this piece of that can be used for humanitarian civic
It's
assessment.
one of the things that being part of SOF is really good because we got P11 dollars.
Pots of money.
Pots of money.
Yep.
Pots of money.
Lots of money there.
So they flew over. This is the funnier part. And so because I'd been training the Bosnian military as well as the special police units, I had a really good relationship with them. And with Colonel Miller and his relationship, we would go over and talk to him. They're like, we have a helicopter for you. And so initially you're like, you can't ride those helicopters, man. I was like, it's going to be okay. It's going to be great. And they're like, I'm telling you, you can't. You make your own decision. I'm like, all right, it's good. This is not a problem. And I get over and there's a video of this on YouTube that Waves for Water did, Waves for Water in Bosnia. And you see me walking up to it. What you can't see is my face looking at this 1970, 1960 UH-1 with like an orange door, talking to a pilot who at this time is pretending to not speak English to me. I'm like, so we're at the map, we're going to land. He goes, yes, we will land. I was like, so here he goes, yes, we will land. And like, we're going to a mountain. Like the mountains in Bosnia are Rockies. Like it is not small. Like they are mountains. And he's like, yeah, we're going to fly up. We will land here. I was like, that's the side of a mountain. He goes, yes. And I'm like, do you understand me? He goes, yes, fly, land here. And I'm like, oh my God.
Sounds like Robin Sage.
It was unreal. And so I get in with him, his co-pilot. We load, like we've got buckets and like the water filters. And John gets in, like, former pro surfer gets in. He's like, this is awesome. And I'm like, okay. And I look and I watch him look up and he takes a Post-it note and flips it around. And I don't know if he put the Post-it note in there, like the toggles were broken, like the GPS. This was not a glass cockpit. Like this is the same cockpit that, the original, first Cav flew in Vietnam. And he's got a TomTom GPS and he's like tapping it and it turns on. And then he fires this thing up and it like sputters smoke. And then he flies that thing mowed the lawn. Like we didn't even go up. We just went forward. And I'm sitting there like I look at my team sergeant, he's looking at me and John and his videographer are like happy as a clam. I was like, we're going to die. And so we get up, we fly for about an hour. We get to the mountains.
So you're saying there's bliss in ignorance.
Bliss in ignorance, man. Oh my God. Yes. And so we get to this mountain town and I'm looking and I'm on the comms and the pilot's like, there, land. And I'm like, oh my God. And I look and I'm like, I can't spot any of this. And I just see a soccer field. And I mean like a high school soccer field with wires around it and a school. And I see people standing outside. I was like, there's no way we're landing there. And he does one circle around the school and looks and he's like pointing, land. And I was like, oh God, oh my God, we're going to die. And he just goes one flare and drops it right in the center of it. I mean, he maybe had 15 feet to the wires on each side of that rotor.
Love it.
And that dude could fly. At this point, he goes, how do you think my landing was? I was like, you speak English. And so we get out, we do the project there. The next day we fly back in. The next day we go do another project together. John and I become friends.
What's the project?
So the project we did was, Waves for Water does access to clean water in remote and austere environments, like, a crazy helicopter ride in the mountains of Bosnia. And each filter is a small gravity-fed Sawyer filter. You can buy it at REI, right, or in Amazon. But the cool part is it's gravity-fed. It takes care of all of your biological, contaminants. and it has a lifespan of 1 million gallons. So you put it on a bucket, you give it to a family of 5, it'll last for 20 years.
Wow.
And it's easily portable. So we had a duffel bag with 100 filters in it, and if you run them at max capacity, that's 100 people per filter per day. So you can make a huge impact for relatively little cost and very small logistical buy-in. And so we did, I think, 50 filters in that one town, so 50 families plus some community centers. And then the next one, I think the first project we did together, we provided access to clean water for about 15,000 people. And so for me, that was great for me to go back to the country team and be like, hey, here's what we've achieved. And they were like, all right, what do you need next? So I went to USAID, tried to find their pots of money, and then went to the UN, found their pots of money, went to a buddy of mine, the Austrian ground force commander that I'd spent some time at a ball and, again, drinking and making relationships. Mm-hmm. And he's like, hey, do you need a Black Hawk helicopter? And I was like, yes, I do.
Yes, I do.
Waves for Water came in for a second round that was funded by USAID. And we flew it to like 10 more villages in my private Black Hawk, where they literally landed it at a gas station, locked the key, and went and got a cup of coffee while we did the project. It blew my mind, and it happened because of relationships. But that built my relationship with John and also showed me the impact of we were able to really have an impact in these communities and close that gap for foreign money and foreign influence to come in to shape that area. We'd been able to close that gap by using a unified action partner, right? Using Waves for Water, utilizing Waves for Water, depending on how we want to go with that word. And that really shaped me going forward. And so that shaped a lot of my experience when I came to SOT-D. Walked into the team room at SOT-D and had the first team leader, SF guy, ran into there, John Johnson, who I love, good friend of mine this day. John. And he looked at me and goes,
well, define SOT-D real quick.
Yeah, so SOT-D, the Special Operations Training Detachment at the CTC that Bobby has been so dutifully pitching this time.
What's their primary purpose?
So primary purpose is to facilitate special operations training at the CTCs. Okay. So provide qualified post-team mentors and trainers and observer coach trainers, and then also provide a realistic training environment that supports critical soft tasks. Is that a good way to say it? I think that's about it.
You just knocked it out of the park.
Man, a lot of people don't want to go to those jobs, right? But they are critical.
I fought it. Honestly,
everybody fights it.
I fought it so hard.
I've fought it my entire career, and so far I've won.
You mean you're telling me you can go to a position where, okay, it's post-team time, but you get to use your own experiences to impart your knowledge and things you've learned to people who are a little bit younger than you going through their training reps. And then you get to
all 9 groups, Civil Affairs, PsyOps, SF.
Yep. And you get to see the diversity of thought that every one of those groups across CA, Civil Affairs, and PsyOps, the way they do things. And you can say, hey, I saw, based off of 1st Special Forces groups, thought processes working in the Pacific, they do things this way. And I saw it work this way. I'm going to coach you through because I saw a way. You take it and see if it works for your team, or you try or experiment at your level and see what works for you guys.
So, I mean, honestly, for me, when I got the orders, I was still in Bosnia, and I looked at this, and mind you, at this point, I hadn't done a day of staff as an officer. Like, I was a platoon leader for 20 plus months. I was an executive officer, almost all that in combat. I was a team leader for 4 years. And I was like, there was not a piece of me that wanted to stop doing work at that point. And to me, and because I agree with you, but at that time, I didn't understand that. So
sure.
The chief of mission and the defense attaché went to town for me, tried to get me to come over, or tried to set it up for me to come over as a softly with my family. I was going to move my whole family to Bosnia, which would have been amazing. But it just, it didn't work out. Once the CTC has you, it's an inescapable force of gravity. And so, but I will say, like, talking to John.
I've escaped it. It's escapable.
It's escapable?
It is escapable.
You're the first, because I'm just saying,
we're not being forced to say this by a CG. We're not getting paid to say all this. And even though I've escaped the CTCs, they are like, it's value added. Like, to be able to affect that many people in a positive manner,
hugely rewarding, to the point where I check in on those folks regularly, and then have the utmost respect. But I try to share that knowledge, impart it, and then preach about it, because I learned a ton.
Yeah, but it comes back to like what you said earlier. Like, I do like Maslow's hierarchy. People think it's ridiculous, but I think that when you're doing things in life, they're at the top of that, and you're making decisions and executing for things that fulfill you in a spiritual manner. And that's not talking about like God or whatever. It's just like what internally, that's where it's at, right? Like, you're doing things that are for positive influence on systems, people, or whatever, right? But that's what the CTC is.
No, it's and I
Or it can be, or it cannot be, depending on you.
I agree with Bobby. Like that job was incredibly rewarding. Incredibly rewarding. And it started on a rough foot because John was like, what are you doing here? Why do you belong? You guys, CA does not belong in this force structure.
And what experience do you have to coach me or give me advice?
Well, it was interesting because he was a fellow coach, right? So he was the SF guy. He's like, what are you doing here? And thankfully, like at that point, I had a ton of experience in both combat and working in the interagency. So I was able to be like, well, this is how. And he goes, oh. And he and I became great friends. But it is that piece. And I everything you said about that job, it was incredibly rewarding. I learned so much from working with people like Chris Perry, who's become one of my best friends, like working with people like you. Colonel Dyke was my first SAT commander, and then Scotty Malone was the second.
Scott Malone.
They were fantastic, right? Those are two of the most amazing officers I had that took care of men in a way that it was just phenomenal. The way that they treated me and made me a part of that team really made the experience down there. So I learned a ton, got to go through that process, and then I left active duty from there.
Okay.
And
Damn, it's a transition right there.
I know, was that good? Is that a little rough?
No, that's
Is it transition from active duty?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
No, the transition is crazy. Like, you're going to go from CTC to not being active duty anymore. Like, most people fear getting out of the Army anyway, right?
Yeah. It was like HR they called and my branch manager was like, you can't come back. I was like, that's the point. The way this came about is I started to talk to John Rose, and I, we stayed in contact. And probably about 2 months prior to me deciding to separate, John had been like, hey, we're doing a lot of work with U.S. embassies. I need some help building kind of a purpose-built team, cross-functional team, if you will, inside of Waves for Water that will be able to work directly with military elements that speak the language and can work from there. And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. He's like, will you help me just design it and build it? I was like, yeah, no problem. And then a month later, he called me back and he's like, hey, this is great. It's awesome. Do you want to come run it? And do you want to come build it? And I looked at him, I was like, well, let me talk to the wife. And he's like, because you're thinking about getting out. I was like, well, I've tossed the idea around. And he's like, I have no idea what I can pay you, man. He's like, we're not big. So I got off the phone. I talked to the wife and I was like, I don't think this phone call happens very often. Like John Rose is an amazing dude who's like built a rad organization with just incredible identity that has an amazing impact. And I was like, how do I say no to this? Like, what is like, does CGSC really mean that much to me? Does being a force provider and a staff officer going forward really mean that much to me? And to what you said, right? Like, I think the word that captures, what you're talking about is purpose. Like, what is your purpose? And if you don't have a clear purpose in your life, and I would argue at this point, having done the job for 10 years on the line in some capacity, right? Never back up in a higher headquarters. I feel like I was starting to lose my purpose because that's all I knew. So I was easily able to look at this, and having done work with John in Bosnia and seen the impact, I was like, this is awesome. And not only do I get to go do this for myself, but I get to build an organization that works with other military. And then John and I went around, I was like, what if we build a veteran organization? So it's not just geared towards working with the U.S. embassies. It's geared towards taking veterans that have separated, have lost their purpose, giving them a new team and a new purpose, in a way that will help them ease transition and give back to the world that they've functioned in for so long. And so that was the birth of the Clean Water Corps. I dropped my paperwork and I left. And I mean, I'll never forget the second I was like, I'm in, he's like, I need you in Guyana in 3 days. And I will never forget the look on Colonel Dyke's face. And I was like, hey, sir, I got to go to Guyana. He's like, what? I was like, tomorrow. It's like, it's a job interview. And he took care of me. He made it happen. But that was the start of it. And it has been 5 years of just like up until Center 2020, when COVID, just hammered the nonprofit space, we did a ton of work, like a ton of work.
So I wanted to ask, so you're kind of talking now of, we've transitioned from the civil affairs entity and a mindset of civil affairs, civil governance, and mapping that population and civil terrain. Now you're looking at humanitarian assistance and disaster response.
100%.
In crisis, helping people get necessities to survive and then to function to get better, to improve the situation. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, we bring access to clean water. We're usually on the ground, 24 hours after the event happens. In some cases, like Hurricane Maria, I was in San Juan. We went down following Hurricane Irma. Did some work cruising around with former drug runners who turned humanitarian logistic nodes. and running on speedboats throughout the Virgin Islands. And then Maria popped up, and I flew into San Juan on the 18th, and I sat on my 36th birthday. I sat in Isla Verde, or Isla Grande, watching the world end around me. Like, it was crazy. I mean, I'm from Idaho, man. I don't know what a hurricane is. Like, I'm not from the East Coast. Like, I know a snowstorm and a blizzard. So when the walls started like bleeding water, and I called Otto Flores, one of the pro surfers, one of my teammates there, I was like, hey man, like, is this normal? Because like the walls were just bleeding. And so we went downstairs at like 3 a.m., sat with the bartender in the hotel we were at, and watched the world end around us taking shots. And that was a crazy experience for me. And then the next day we got up and started to go to work. And it's been that way from, partnering with BMW and riding across the Gobi Desert to following the floods in Peru to the Amazon Chris Perry and some of my team did a crazy work after Hurricane Adele or Cyclone Adele in Mozambique. And it's just one of those things where taking some of the skills that we have in the military, specifically in special operations, and then applying it to a humanitarian thought process, which really comes down to the ability to build relationships at all level. Like I always told my PMs and my vets coming in, like, look, I need you to go to a CEO's office of a Fortune 500 and build relationship and get support from him. And in the same day, take a 12-hour boat ride and get to a small village, all the way up the Amazon River in the jungle and build relationship with the local power broker in that village. Then I also need you to plan logistics along that entire route. And I need you to build relationships that'll facilitate that. It's the same thing that we do from the special operations side of the house. It's just applied to bringing a need to a people. And I feel like I went on a little bit of a tangent.
No, so what I think is fascinating, though, is you've now kind of pivoted in your career to become a first responder, whereas with the military side, you're constrained by authorities or requirements.
Yep.
You have to wait for the United States government to deploy you in that
Completely.
HADR capacity.
Yep.
On the nonprofit side, you're just going.
Yeah, absolutely.
You are, crisis has happened, catastrophe has happened, you're headed out there right now.
Yep.
Two things I want to kind of ask in that realm is we've talked, so Chuck and I talked with CX John Troxel, and he preached a lot on fighter management. How do you talk or think about responder management on the ground for first responders and taking care of the people that you're working with and managing their energies?
So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to that. So it depends on, am I bringing in, are we talking about like my external team that I bring into the scenario, or am I talking about the team that I build on the ground, right? Because we still work that by, with, and through thought process of the Clean Water Corps, right? I want to go in, I want to find people that are motivated, already having making a difference, having an impact. And then I want to give them the training and equipment. I want to teach them how to do the program, how to manage the filters, and I want to basically equip them so they can expand that impact and do more. So it's kind of two thought process, right? I have to manage my team of trainers, and then I have to manage the team that's on the ground. And I think managing the team on the ground, the local team, is harder because I have to manage their relationships and what's going on in their life, because their entire world is just ended around them. So Otto Flores is a great example. His entire family, we moved out of his house, boarded it up. His two sons, his dog, his mom, his wife stayed in the hotel. Hotel got crushed, so we had to leave the hotel, and we were calling different people that he knew that had fled the island and breaking into different apartment buildings. At times we were trading fuel with different areas for generators to get access to places to stay. And so it took us 3 or 4 days to get his family taken care of before he could even focus on doing the work I needed him to do.
It's like when you see in the movies, asteroid's about to hit, right, and you've got the security guard who's sitting there just guarding the gate. That guy's family is thinking about evacuating.
Exactly.
So that guy's also going to panic internally.
Yeah.
But in the movies, he's just calm, cool, collected, and just guarding this.
Which is ridiculous.
Which isn't realistic.
No. Well, it goes down to too, if you're managing your team, in the military, if you're doing a good job of it, you understand what's going on in your team, in your guy's life, because that home life, what they have going on, affects everything.
Affects readiness.
It affects readiness.
Yeah.
Oh God, that's definitely an officer point for bringing in readiness. But yeah, that's the thought process, right? There is no difference, and I think he's right. Fighter management or responder management, it's the same thing. You're still managing people. It still comes down to leadership. The principles and the attributes are still the same. It is just understand that you cannot look at your team as numbers. You have to look at them as people address those needs, and then motivate them and create that shared vision so they can execute. It's the same thing.
But I also want to say, you get 2 extra officer points for playing the officer game of trying to arbitrarily allocate officer points
Deflect
to your
officer
peer. so that you beat
I didn't know
him.
if you were going to pick up what I was doing. I'm playing that game. Damn, you caught me.
Hey, but while we're talking about that,
Yeah.
and just we're at the end of the podcast. I just want to share with Bobby what me and you were looking at earlier in regards to Bosnia, Ukraine. So there's a commonality in Ukraine between Vladimir Putin, Batman, and Will Smith.
Yep.
You know what it is?
I have no idea.
Well, between
What's the
Putin
overlap?
and Batman, rules through fear, right? Batman and Will Smith, no. Putin and Will Smith came to prominence via top secret intelligence agency, right? And then through all 3 of them, attacked a comedian.
It's so good.
For those of you who don't know, Zelensky was a comedian.
Yeah.
Before he came to power.
I saw a few of his videos.
That's
His
what we were
music
laughing about
videos.
earlier when he was like, "Damn it."
That's so good. I could not even focus. Once you put that, it was so good. Well, I love that in his TV show, he played a teacher that becomes a president in the TV show, and then he becomes the president. It's more entertaining.
There is a corruption problem in Ukraine, right?
Absolutely.
But I don't think that validates what's going on now. I mean, that is a problem in the country post-Soviet Union, but it's almost to the core of what's acceptable as a society there, right? Like that takes a long time to...
So it's going to be really interesting. And from our perspective, and like my team, having a few teams on the ground that are working there now and getting direct feedback from them, the number one business, I think they said for the next 10 years is going to be rubble removal. Yeah. Right. And there's going to be an insane economic...
all 3 of us should create a company.
That offer's on the table. But so you look at it and there's going to be a
powers
huge...
combined.
There's going to be a huge power vacuum, right?
Yeah.
And so, like I said earlier, Ukraine's history is going to be rooted in this moment. But what they do after this, can Zelensky, who had shown himself to be a typical Eastern European leader prior to this event,
And now change that.
can he ride this national movement, this national identity?
And like you said, now they have this. Now they have a national identity.
Exactly.
Which they didn't have really after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Correct.
Right? But now they do. So maybe Russia's done them a favor.
I think they have. I actually think
a horribly implemented favor, but
yes.
but look at the cycle of every great nation,
Right.
requires some kind of struggle and violence.
Absolutely. I think if Zelensky if he survives this, if he can maintain the momentum and the identity, and he does at his heart, which I think he does, want to build back a less corrupt, more modern European state, I think they'll be successful. But there's going to be a lot of work because the amount of foreign actors, because what you have now, you have a front. Now, a lot of people don't understand this. Like, all of Ukraine is not burning. You have a legitimate front. You have legitimate combat areas, and it's almost World War II style. Behind that front, there's resource control measures, there's restrictions. But
You just had Ukraine participating in a World Cup friendly
Exactly.
to make the World Cup.
Right.
The world is still going on.
Yeah.
Life is still progressing for Ukraine.
And that
except
country to
for
the
place-
west, other than the amount of logistics and everything going through and the shift and how that looks, there's still people positioning themselves, like not necessarily positive actors that are positioning themselves for when this ends. If you think people wait until the conflict is over to start to piece off that future, you're completely wrong.
You missed the boat.
And that's going to be the challenge is Zelensky in the right place with the right mindset and the right team to go away from that? And is the international community in a position to mitigate that as well, to support him? There's a lot of unknowns with how that's going to shape out because it is Eastern Europe.
Which is a weird place.
It's a weird place. It's a great place. I love it.
All of Europe is to our mind.
Oh yeah, completely different.
Yeah.
It's not the same. And people tend to
I don't even think
that.
they understand it.
No.
It's kind of like going to Afghanistan. Like, hey guys, like explain to me like the whole tribal culture. Like, and then you're like, okay, you guys don't even understand what.
No.
You guys don't understand Pashtunwali either. Like, no, but it's our culture. It's what it is.
Yep.
We understand it in this little part, this little vacuum right there.
Very complicated. All right, next one. So, Rob McQueen. What is your relationship to Lightning or Steve McQueen?
So no relationship to Lightning McQueen, unfortunately, as my
That
daughters
sucks.
are very disappointed. But Steve McQueen, according to my aunt and my mother who've done the research, is my great half uncle. So he was half brothers with my grandfather. So they shared the same dad, different moms.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, never got to meet him. Like, it would have been rad. He died before I was born.
It's still pretty badass.
It's pretty badass, right? A little bit of legacy.
Favorite Rob, favorite Steve McQueen.
Lots of Rob McQueen stories.
There's a lot of, yeah.
Favorite Steve McQueen character.
Papillon, for sure. 100%. Great Escape's great. Sand Pebbles is good, but like Papillon, man, that's such a good movie.
Rob, all right, as our last topic for our Pineland Underground episode, I want to talk to you about Sine Pare, or Without Equal.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that. Talk to me about what you guys are doing, and enlighten us and our audience, please.
Yeah, so myself, two good friends of mine, Chris Perry, 23 years first group, and Steve Cargill, former 10th group guy. We got together, came up with the idea to kind of do leadership development, right? How do we, as we transition from the humanitarian space and we look at the way forward, how do we help shape kind of the leadership dynamic in this country? And I think we could probably all look at it and see across pretty much every sector out there gaps in leadership, right? I think that's a key part. And so we looked at ways we can influence that, and we built Sine Pare. We took a pretty advanced leadership methodology created by my partner, Steve. We have access and use to an incredible campus outside Huntsville, Texas, a 1,200 acres of training facility, pretty much our own Camp McCall. And we run executives, junior leaders, and team members through a 48 to 72 hour experiential leadership experience, right? It's a crucible. Like, we put them through real world scenarios, complex obstacles, run them through different team positions, start them at a small team, work them all the way up to a 12-man team in a more or less full mission profile. And we really stress them out. And then we let them go through that learning model and really gain a lot of experience in a short period of time. And go from there. So it's an awesome experience.
To stress inoculation.
That's exactly what we do. That's exactly what we do.
Which is something that, just talking to some buddies, even in the law enforcement area, that's most people outside of SOF don't have that.
No.
And it's important, right? Because what do you do when all these chemicals are pumping that you're not used to?
Yeah.
And you have to make a decision.
Yeah, it's been amazing. The first class we ran October of last year, we had a variety from nonprofit founders to vice presidents, and one of the nonprofit founders, she runs an organization called Off the Grid Missions, and so she was just in Ukraine last week and sent us. She was like, if I hadn't gone through that, I wouldn't have been able to manage the stress I was under. And I was like, that's a huge feedback and a benefit for us. And so we've got a great team of former CA, Green Berets, PsyOp, agency, just amazing people that love to do this. So it's great to get together with a team on an amazing location in Texas. And then because
Texas is amazing anyway.
It would be Texas, wouldn't it?
It is the greatest country in the world.
It has that potential. That's a fact. Although there's a lot of California, just like Idaho, there's a lot of Californians going into Texas too. So I think you're going to run into a conversation on that piece. But yeah,
it's to California. That's why I was sneezing.
But yeah, it's an amazing company. We're excited to get it off the ground and move it forward. We have another class coming up in October, and we're just growing from there. We have a good podcast called Without Equal, where we talk about leadership, break down historical references, and then honestly talk about some of our experiences and personal stories. So it's been a good time. So please listen. And then if you're curious, it's cinepare.com. So cine-pare.com.
And you also
that's
have
our
a podcast,
website.
correct?
That is, yeah. Without Equal is a podcast. We're on all the major podcast feeds. Just search Without Equal. And that's us.
I absolutely love that. So you brought together experienced RSOF members, veterans, individuals, first responders who have quite a bit of experience, giving back, pumping those attributes back into corporate America, and just really kind of sewing together a nice fabric of patriotism, but how that leadership, pendulum kind of can blanket the future of America.
Yeah, I mean, it's that purpose, right? Like, take what we've learned and the experience that we've been thankful enough to have, and then just roll it into the people that haven't gone down that path, and make them better for it. Because the higher the level is across our country, the better off we are as a nation as a whole. And to be able to impact that, I think, is a rad thing. And my life's been focused on purpose. I've kind of chased it at every turn. It's worked out for me, and the opportunity to give back and work through that process is just awesome.
Well, Rob, to me, that kind of articulates a life of service. You have given back in the Army. You've given back as a special operations member. You've looked at the civil blanket of where we have been across the conflict continuum. And then you've also dabbled in the humanitarian side, getting important things, survivability to people who need it as a first responder on the ground on behalf of our nation, but really on behalf of just the greater good of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
So life at service is kind of a way to nicely round it out. And I'd say just 1, good job. 2, keep representing, and then 3, we're proud of you, and keep stay tied into the SOF community and the Army community for what you guys need going forward.
Absolutely, it's given me so much. I'm just happy to give back in any way I can.
Any closing comments from Chuck and Rob?
No, I'll just say that Rob, this guy's been like, man, we got to get Rob McQueen on the podcast for forever, and we finally got you on here because it just happened that you're going to be here, and yeah, he was like, hey, look, this guy runs a podcast. It's superior to ours. What?
Definitely not.
He never said it, but
definitely not.
He said, hey, that's one of the ones we need to look at. We need to make sure that, when we talk about lessons learned and how to make ourselves better. And then it's probably last week. He's like, hey, Rob's going to be here. Let's get him on the podcast. I was like, hell yeah. Because we're talking about, hey, we're very SF heavy with this podcast, which is kind of jacked up. So, next week we have a PSYOP. Really, probably one of the person that I understand, the most knowledgeable people within PSYOP to talk about the regiment and the history.
Oh, epic.
And we have you on, and we have, Tulsi Gabbard coming up pretty soon as well. So I think that's pretty cool. We're really tying in the message of, to win the game, you got to understand a higher level. You can't get just in your niche about, I'm this. No, if you want to win the overall game, there's a bigger picture there.
Yep.
How do you do that?
You got to understand your role, right?
Right. And everybody else's role. And then what is the end state and what's going on and how do you best influence, and I'd say in SOF, instead of just kicking a door, shooting somebody in the face, our real claim to fame is that we can take something, the battlefield, and instead of saying we got to do X, Y, Z, we take everything. It's almost like the movie Inception. We manipulate and round and take that and curve everything around us to achieve an end state versus something linear.
Yep, completely.
All right, so that's Major Rob McQueen, veteran, family man, mentor, humanitarian, and entrepreneur. Rob, thanks for being on Pineland Underground tonight. Really appreciate it, man.
He could also be a model if he wanted to be.
Could be. He doesn't have a beard, but he's got really good hair.
He had a beard until today.
Yeah, the beard is much better. As my wife said, it's the male push-up bra. So I rock that thing all the time. Yeah. It's a win.
You see the picture in his bio? What is he drinking? Is it Coors Light in mugs? Rocking your.
So if anybody from Sports Illustrated is listening, reach out.
Oh God,
needs to be on the cover.
All right, signing off from Pineland Underground at the Falcon Snail Pub. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks for tuning in to Pineland Underground. Please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Join us next time as we explore more critical topics from the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School, the Special Operations Center of Excellence. I'm your host, Major Bobby Tuttle, and we'll see you next time in Pineland Underground.